Hillary Brown had always dreamed of becoming a painter. Her mother, a woman who had supported every one of her artistic endeavors, was her biggest cheerleader. Growing up in a small town in the heart of New England, Hillary had spent her youth surrounded by canvas and paint, always creating something new, something beautiful. She had a modest but vibrant studio in her home, where she poured her heart into every brushstroke. Her mother's encouragement was all she had ever needed, and it was all she ever wanted. But that dream was never shared by her husband, Tony. Tony Brown was a man with a good heart but little ambition. He was a man who had never quite figured out his place in the world. Unlike Hillary, who had an unshakable belief in herself and her art, Tony floated through life with little direction. He had no respect for Hillary's career as an artist, dismissing it as a mere hobby, something that didn't pay the bills. While Hillary worked tirelessly to perfect her craft and to make a name for herself in the art world, Tony would be found at home, watching TV or working on some low-paying job that didn't demand much from him. He never seemed to understand the importance of her art, never acknowledged the sacrifices she made to follow her passion. Despite their differences, Hillary loved Tony. They had built a life together. They had a home, shared experiences, and even shared some laughter. But in recent years, their relationship had begun to fray at the edges. Tony's apathy towards her work, his failure to appreciate her efforts, began to erode the foundation of their marriage. Hillary tried to ignore the growing divide between them, convincing herself that love would be enough to overcome their differences. But it wasn't. Then came the day Hillary's mother passed away. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon when the phone call came. Hillary had been in her studio, working on a new painting, when the news shattered her world. Her mother had been battling cancer for months, but Hillary had never truly prepared herself for the inevitable. She rushed to the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest, but it was too late. Her mother was gone. The funeral was a blur of tears, family, and empty words of condolence. Hillary felt numb, lost in a sea of grief. She had always known that losing her mother would be one of the hardest things she would ever face, but nothing could have prepared her for the weight of the loss. She felt as if she had lost a part of herself, a part that she could never get back. But the pain was not just in losing her mother. It was in the realization that she had lost something else, something even more precious, her sense of self. In the weeks following her mother's death, Hillary found herself in a deep state of reflection. She spent hours alone in her studio, trying to find solace in her art. But it wasn't enough. She began to question everything about her life, her marriage, and her future. Tony seemed distant, too wrapped up in his own world to offer any real support. They had always been a team, but now it felt like they were strangers passing through life together, each of them retreating into their own separate spaces. As Hillary tried to navigate the storm of emotions swirling inside her, another event began to unfold: the issue of her mother's inheritance. Her mother had left behind a small fortune, which included a modest house, some investments, and a few valuable family heirlooms. For the first time in years, Hillary was forced to deal with her family's financial matters. As the sole heir, the inheritance was rightfully hers. However, Tony's attitude toward the inheritance would be the catalyst that changed everything. Tony's indifference towards her career was one thing, but his reaction to her mother's estate was something entirely different. When the topic came up, Tony seemed more concerned about how much of the inheritance he could claim for himself than about offering his wife any emotional support during such a trying time. He was less interested in honoring Hillary's mother's memory and more interested in what he could gain. He wanted Hillary to sell her mother's house, to cash out on the investments, and to put the money towards better things, things he was sure would help them live a more comfortable life. He even suggested they buy a bigger house, something more fitting for their growing family. The suggestion made Hillary's stomach turn. Hillary had always known that Tony was more interested in comfort and material success than anything else, but his greed over her mother's legacy felt like a betrayal. The house, the investments, and the heirlooms, they represented more than just money. They were memories, a connection to her mother, to her past. And yet, Tony had no regard for that. He couldn't see beyond the dollar signs. To him, it was all about the opportunity to upgrade their lifestyle, to live more lavishly, without ever considering the emotional cost of such decisions. One night, as Hillary sat in the dimly lit living room, staring out the window into the darkness, she realized that she couldn't continue like this. She couldn't keep sacrificing her own happiness, her own dreams, for a man who didn't value her or what she stood for. She thought back to her mother's words, the advice she had given her throughout her life, urging Hillary to follow her passion, to never let anyone or anything stand in the way of her dreams. Her mother had always believed in her, even when Hillary didn't believe in herself. It was time for Hillary to believe in herself again. The next day, she had a conversation with Tony that would change everything. Sitting across from him at their kitchen table, she explained how she felt. She told him that she couldn't continue living in a marriage that was so one-sided, so emotionally draining. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. She told him that the inheritance was hers, not just financially, but emotionally. She needed to honor her mother's memory in her own way, not in a way that benefited him. She needed to take control of her life, to reclaim her independence. Tony listened, but his response was not what Hillary had hoped for. Instead of understanding, he became defensive. He argued that they needed the money, that it was foolish to hold on to sentimental attachments to something that could give them a better life. He told her that if she chose to be so stubborn about it, their marriage would never work. His words were sharp, filled with resentment. It was as if he had never truly cared about what she wanted, only about what she could provide. And that's when Hillary made the decision. She stood up from the table, took a deep breath, and walked out of the room. She knew that her path forward was clear. She needed to let go of Tony, let go of the life they had built together, and start anew. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, but it was the only way she could truly heal. She couldn't continue to live in the shadow of his indifference and greed. The divorce was finalized within months. Hillary moved into her mother's house, the place that had always been a sanctuary for her. It wasn't just a house, it was a symbol of her strength, her independence, and her ability to start over. As she settled into her new life, she began to paint again, pouring every ounce of emotion, every bit of pain, and every ounce of joy into her art. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again. She felt free. Over time, Hillary's work began to gain recognition. Her paintings, once just an expression of herself, now told stories that resonated with others. She sold pieces to galleries, and even began hosting her own exhibitions. The art world, which she had once doubted she could ever be a part of, now embraced her as one of its own. In the end, Hillary realized that her true path had always been there, waiting for her to find it. The death of her mother, the dissolution of her marriage, the inheritance, they were all turning points, pieces of the puzzle that led her back to who she truly was. And now, as she stood in her studio, brush in hand, she knew that her journey was just beginning. As Hillary stood at the door of the family home, the weight of the decision she had just made pressed heavily on her chest. The house, which had once been filled with laughter and promises, now felt like a prison, a cold, empty reminder of everything she had lost. She thought back to the days when she and Tony had first met, when their love had felt genuine and full of hope. It was hard to believe that the man standing before her now was the same person who had once shared her dreams, her vision for the future. Tony, still unaware of the storm that had been brewing in Hillary's heart for years, tried to pull her back into their life together, his voice pleading. But Hillary was no longer the woman who would shrink in the face of Tony's demands. She had shed that version of herself like a second skin, realizing that in order to reclaim her life, she would have to leave behind the person who had helped her lose it. She didn't say much. There was no need. Tony could sense it in the way she held herself, in the stillness of her gaze. It wasn't anger that fueled her decision, but something far more powerful. The realization that her life was her own to live, not something to be dictated by the neglect and manipulation of someone who had never truly seen her. She could feel the breath of freedom in her lungs, and for the first time in years, it felt like she could finally breathe. "I can't do this anymore, Tony," Hillary said softly, her voice steady, despite the tears that threatened to spill. "You've never supported me. You've never understood who I am, or what I need. I've spent too long trying to please you, trying to make you see me as more than just your wife. But I can't keep pretending. I can't stay here any longer." Tony's face twisted in disbelief, then anger. He tried to grab her arm, his grip tight, but Hillary pulled away. For the first time, she saw the man behind the facade of her husband. The man who had once promised to be her partner, but had instead become a barrier to her happiness. "You're throwing everything away," Tony spat, his voice full of venom. "You'll regret this. You won't make it without me." But Hillary wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't afraid. She had lived in fear for far too long, and now she was taking control of her future. She had learned to trust herself, her instincts, and most importantly, her worth. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal battles and emotional upheaval. Hillary fought not only for her financial independence, but also for her identity. Tony fought back with everything he had, playing the victim, trying to manipulate her into returning. But Hillary was stronger now, and she refused to fall back into the familiar trap of guilt and doubt. As the divorce papers were finalized, Hillary felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't just the end of her marriage to Tony. It was the end of an era in her life, one that had been dominated by emotional manipulation and neglect. She was free. But the road to freedom was not without its challenges. For months, Hillary focused on herself, on rebuilding her career as a painter, on rediscovering the joy that had once filled her life. She spent long hours in her studio, pouring her emotions onto the canvas. Each stroke of the brush was a step toward healing, a reclamation of the woman she had once been. Her art became her voice. Through her paintings, she expressed the pain and the triumph of her journey. And in that process, Hillary rediscovered something even more profound than her independence. She rediscovered her passion for life, her love for herself, and the power that came from choosing her own path. But even in her newfound freedom, Hillary knew that her journey was far from over. She had learned many lessons along the way, lessons about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of having the courage to walk away from what no longer served her. She had learned that love, true love, was not about sacrifice and submission, but about respect, support, and partnership. In the months that followed, Hillary's art gained recognition. Galleries invited her to display her work, and her paintings spoke to others who had also experienced the pain of manipulation and loss. Through her art, Hillary found a way to connect with people who understood her struggles, who saw her for who she truly was, and who admired her for her strength. But it wasn't just her art that was flourishing. Hillary herself was changing. She was no longer the woman who had been trapped in an unhealthy marriage, trying to make it work at all costs. She was no longer the woman who had neglected her own dreams for the sake of someone else's. She was Hillary Brown, a woman who had learned to value herself, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to create the life she had always dreamed of. Her journey was one of emotional growth, of finding herself after years of losing who she was. It was a journey of resilience and self-discovery. And in the end, Hillary had come to realize that true empowerment came not from relying on others, but from trusting in her own strength, her own vision, and her own heart.